Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mary Pat Higgins. I'm the president and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and it just warms my heart to see this audience full today. Thank you so much for being with us to hear best-selling author Lois Lowry. Today's program is presented in conjunction with the Candy Brown Holocaust and Human Rights Educator series, and I'd like to give a special thank you to the generous supporters of that series, Candy and Ike Brown. Please help me thank them. I'd also like to give a warm welcome to the educators in attendance today. Thank you so much for your commitment to your students and for taking time out of your summer to be with us. Please wave your hand and let the rest of us applaud you for the work you do day in and day out with our students. Yay! We love having you here. Thanks so much for trusting us to do professional education for you in the summer. I'd also like to thank our community partners for today's program: Communities Foundation of Texas, Dallas Jewish Historical Society, SMU Human Rights Program, and Southwest Jewish Congress. So today, we're all excited and honored to be hearing from Lois Lowry, an American writer and the beloved author of several books for children and young adults, including Number the Stars, On the Horizon, and The Giver. A two-time Newbery winner, Lowry is known for writing about difficult subjects, dystopias, and complex themes in works for young audiences. At the end of today's presentation, we'll have time for questions. So if you joined us in person, please use the note card that you were given as you were coming in and write your question on the note card. Our staff will come around and get the cards, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. If you are joining us virtually, please put your question in the chat box or the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and we'll do our best to answer as many of those questions too. And for those of you joining us in person, I'd like to ask you to just take a minute and make sure that your phone is silenced so we can all enjoy Lois's presentation without distractions. So now it is my great honor to welcome Lois Lowry.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll get myself arranged. Some of you are old friends, and many of you told me today that you saw me in Irving about a month ago. Wasn't that long. I feel as though I'm in Texas a lot lately, which is a pleasure. But when I was thinking about coming here 2 days ago, planning what to wear, what to bring, all of that, I remembered something, and I think this was probably 2 years ago. Some of you will know. It was when suddenly, well, how can I tell this? I got a call from a producer at CNN saying there had been an event or an episode, an incident in, was it South Lake, Texas? Okay, some of you are going to recognize this. And would I be willing to be interviewed the next morning on CNN? And the incident was that a school administrator had decreed that no teacher in this school district could teach any book unless they would also teach a book with an opposing viewpoint. And the question was raised by a fourth grade teacher. I teach Number the Stars. How can there be an opposing viewpoint? And so it became a bit of a cause célèbre, and the directive was withdrawn ultimately. But in the meantime, sitting up in Maine, I'd been asked if I could be interviewed by a guy on CNN the next morning. And I said, okay. And then they said it would be at 6 o'clock the next morning. And I am not a morning person, but I had agreed to do it. So at 5 o'clock, I got up and combed my hair and sat at my computer, and that's how the interview took place. Afterward, I thought, oh God, I was half asleep. I looked horrible. I was inarticulate. I wish I hadn't done that. And I never went back until 2 days ago. I thought, gee, I'm going to be in Texas. And I'm going to be, I think, quite near South Lake. Am I getting that name right? Is that correct? Yeah. I guess I'll see if I can find out what I said that morning. And so I Googled CNN, Lois Lowry, South Lake. I put in several appropriate words, and indeed, there it came up on YouTube as the whole interview. I looked away because I did indeed look half asleep, but I had the sound on, and I listened to what I had to say, and I ended up thinking, I said that one thing that sounds pretty eloquent and appropriate. I'm glad I said that. And here is what I rediscovered 2 days ago. The interviewer, whose name I don't remember, had said, how did you feel when you heard that Number of the Stars was in trouble in Texas? I don't remember how he phrased it. But what I said was, at first I chuckled because it seemed so silly. And then I realized it wasn't silly, it was ignorant. And then I realized how easily and dangerously ignorance turns into evil. So I give you that little eloquent phrase that I said 2 mornings ago because I do believe it to be true. And ignorance is, to fight ignorance is why we have places like this museum and many others that I have been to and spoken at, and one of which, the Holocaust Memorial and Museum in Berlin, was designed by my husband's cousin, an American Jewish architect. And if you've never been there, you should. It's an amazing memorial. Okay, none of that was what I had planned to say today, but I've written 52 books. The 52nd was just published. I could come here once a week and talk to you about a different book each week. But because of where we are, this is the book I'm talking about today. And I think I'm going to have to speed through some of these because there's a clock here telling me the minutes are ticking away. This is my friend, Annalisa Platt. She is no longer living, but I met her when we were young housewives together in Portland, Maine. Our children were best friends. And she had been born and grew up in Denmark. At one point, she and I went on vacation together for a week, left our horrible teenage children home, and spent a week together. And that's a time when we sat and talked for most of our days together. And we talked about our childhoods. We're more or less the same age, but she had been born in and grown up in Copenhagen. And we discovered on that vacation together that we both had one thing in common, that we had each lost an older sister when we were young. My first book was about the death of my older sister. My sister had died of cancer. Her sister, she told me, had been newly married, expecting a baby, and had died in childbirth along with the baby. And I was startled by that. That's the wrong word. I was shocked because I had been to Denmark. In fact, my husband had been hospitalized in Copenhagen once when his back went out on a trip. And I knew what a modern and competent medical system they have there. And I said, how could that happen? How could a young woman die in childbirth in Denmark? And she said, it was 1943. We were occupied by the Nazis. She went on to tell me what had happened in Copenhagen, in Denmark. And it was as if I'd not heard it before. And yet, I was a college graduate. I'd gone to graduate school. I wasn't a history major, but surely I had taken history courses that had told me what happened in Denmark, and I had not remembered it. It was such a wonderful story, and I was already a writer for young people. I decided it would be a story to be told for kids. And so that's when I set about to write the book that became Number the Stars. Incidentally, Annalise is buried in Denmark, and every now and then her daughter tells me she goes to the grave and finds that somebody has left a little memento there. The book, Number the Stars, is dedicated to Annalise, and she was present at the Newbery Awards ceremony, so people knew of her connection to that book, and they still honor her for that. At any rate, this is the child on the cover of the book. When I finished graduate school, I had studied photography as well as literature, and for a while I worked as a photojournalist, and for a while I specialized in portraits of children, and this is a picture I took in 1977, commissioned by the child's parents, who were Swedish. Her father was a Swedish consul to the United States, and she was a very Swedish-looking child, Scandinavian-looking child. And when the publisher called me, after the book had been written and it was in the hands of the publisher, and they were making decisions about a cover, people are often surprised to find that the author doesn't have any say in the cover generally. Sometimes it's a terrible shock when you see the cover of a book you've written. But this time they called me and said, what should the little girl, the main character in the book, who incidentally the book deals with a Christian child, this one, 10 years old, and her Jewish friend. And many kids have asked me, why is the Christian child on the cover of the book and not the Jewish child? And I explained to them that the protagonist of a book is always the one who has to make decisions. And the choices that character makes is what moves the plot of a book along. And in these circumstances, in Denmark in 1943, the Jewish people, the little Jewish girl, had no decisions to make. It was the Christians who made the decisions, and that's why the Christian child's on the cover of the book. So the publisher called me and asked what the little girl should look like. They were about to hire an artist. And so this was a photograph. I still had a copy of it at home. And I sent it to them and said she should give this to the artist. She should look Scandinavian, blonde, blue-eyed like this child. And they wrote back and said, can we use the photograph? So I tracked down the child's parents to get their permission, and they laughed. And they said, you'll have to call her. She's all grown up. I took this picture in 1977. The child was 10. The book was published in 1989, 12 years later, so she would have been, at that point, 22. Now, I'm not going to try to do the math, but that's 36 years ago the book was published. This pretty young girl now has grandchildren. So she's been immortalized on the cover of the book. I got permission to use her photograph, but it was the publisher who decided to superimpose the necklace. And a word about the necklace and a word about Tennessee. There's a large group of you here from Tennessee, and I asked some of you, do you know Helen Bowman? And nobody did, but why should you? I met Helen Bowman many years ago, and she was a fourth grade teacher in Tennessee, in Johnson City. And the reason I've always remembered her is because of a story she told me having to do with this necklace on the cover of the book. Helen Bowman was a fourth grade teacher in Johnson City, and she was reading Number the Stars, a chapter each day, to her fourth grade class. She is not Jewish, but she went to a jewelry store and bought a necklace identical to the one on the cover of the book. And on the last day of reading this book, she wore the necklace. The children, she said, noticed it right away. And so she took it off and gave it to them, and they passed it around. Now, in the book, she had already read, of course, this chapter, in which the Nazi soldiers, as happened in real life in October of 1943, the Nazis went to the home or apartment of every Jewish family in Denmark, banged on the door, intending to take the Jews away. They had a ship waiting in the harbor to house them and to take them to the extermination camps. The Christian population, having been alerted to this, had hidden all the Jews. And so all those apartments were empty. But in the book, the Jewish child, who is the best friend of this little blonde girl, is spending the night with her family, and they're pretending that she's one of their daughters. And the soldiers come to their door because they have gone to the apartment of the Jewish family, not found them at home. And they've come to their door to see where are the Rosens. And the child, the blonde child, Anne-Marie in the book, pulls the necklace from the neck of her friend Ellen and holds it clenched in her hand. The chapter concludes with, as the soldiers leave angrily, Anne-Marie relaxed the clenched fingers of her right hand, which still clutched Ellen's necklace. She looked down and saw that she had imprinted the Star of David into her palm. Helen Bowman told me that she gave the necklace to a child in the class, and as she read the final chapter in this book, she watched, and each child in the room pressed the Star of David into their own hands. She went on to do that year after year. She's long retired now. But I often think of that and those children who are grown up now, and how they had imprinted so much into themselves with the reading of that and the teacher who gave them that gift. Oh, I should back up to say the black cover there is the original cover of the book. I think I signed a couple of them today. The blue one is a more contemporary edition. I don't know why publishers make those decisions, but the book covers change along the way. And I just am quickly going to show you, this book was eventually published in, I think, 32 countries. And I'm going to get some of these languages wrong. Maybe you can correct me. One of these is Turkish and one is Hungarian, I think. Dutch and either Portuguese or Spanish. Either Japanese or Chinese. I should know that because I've lived in Japan, but I confess I don't. And again, either Portuguese or Spanish. Some of you will know the answer to that. French, obviously. We all took French in school. We can translate that. And Hebrew. Okay, many, many others. And these are just 6 that I've shown you. I have one more that I'm going to show you later because it has very special meaning for me. This is a painting that I encountered somewhere of the Jewish section of Copenhagen way back. Denmark had and has a constitution that was put into existence, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the date, probably 1835, which forbids discrimination on the basis of race or religion. 1835 is a time when we still had slavery in this country. Denmark has always been a very forward-thinking place. And this is just a painting of their Jewish colony in 1871. And this is a map just to show you, a little hard to describe, but there's Denmark on the left. Jutland is a part of Denmark, as is Zealand, and on the right is Sweden. This is just to show you how close together Denmark and Sweden are. The way that the Danes saved their Jewish population is by smuggling them to Sweden, which was an independent country. It had taken no side in World War II. So the Jews were safe in Sweden, and they were taken there by boat under great difficulty. Okay, here's the king. King of Denmark, King Christian. This is 1940, what does it say, 1940, before the country is overtaken by the Nazis. I had to, in writing this book, knowing it would be for a certain age level of kids, I had to give them certain information without it turning into a history lesson. But they needed to know some things. And so this is how I had to do something else as well. In doing research, I came again and again across human, personal, true anecdotes that were so moving that I wanted to include some of them. And some of them I had to leave out because they just didn't fit in the book. But here is one that I included. I will tell you also, here one more picture of the king. My friend Annalisa had told me that when she was a child, the king, King Christian, rode his horse out through the streets of Copenhagen each day, and that she had stood on the sidewalk and waved to him, and he had waved back. The Nazis occupied Denmark in 1943, and they allowed the king to live under house arrest, and they allowed him to ride his horse, as he always had each day, because it kept the people pacified. So in doing the research, I came across this personal anecdote, and I was able to incorporate it this way. One evening, Papa had told her that earlier he was on an errand near his office, standing on the corner, waiting to cross the street, when King Christian came by on his morning ride. One of the German soldiers had turned suddenly and asked a question of a teenage boy nearby. "Who is that man who rides past here every morning on his horse?" the German soldier had asked. Papa said he had smiled to himself, amused that the German soldier did not know. He listened while the boy answered. "He's our king," the boy told the soldier. "He's the king of Denmark." "Where is his bodyguard?" the soldier had asked. And do you know what the boy said? Papa had asked Anne-Marie. She was sitting on his lap. She was little then, only 7. She shook her head, waiting to hear the answer. The boy looked right at the soldier, and he said, "All of Denmark is his bodyguard." That was a true story that I read, and so I sneaked it into the book as part of the fictional story. And this is Mr. Dukwitz. I guess you can read that. He's the German diplomat who discovered that Hitler had sent down the directive that all the Jews were to be rounded up. I said they'd occupied the country in 1943. I was mistaken. They had been there for a couple of years. And now, in 1943, Hitler says, time to round up all those Danish Jews. And it was to happen in October of 1943. Dukwitz was a civilian, but he says he served as an attaché for Nazi Germany, and he was in Denmark, and he discovered this directive had come down. And he was so appalled that he went to the Danish government and told them. The government officials went to the rabbi and told him, and the Nazis had confiscated the lists of Jewish families, their addresses. They had all of those names and addresses. And this was to happen at the end of October. This is the Bishop of Copenhagen. Denmark has a state religion, Protestant, Lutheran, and he wrote a letter that was read in all the Christian churches in Denmark on October 3rd. And it says, "Our different religious views notwithstanding, we shall fight for the cause that our Jewish brothers and sisters may preserve the same freedom which we ourselves evaluate more highly than life itself." So now the Christian population knows that this is going to happen. The Jewish people are aware that they have to hide, and it sets the whole set of events in motion. This is just another map. You can see where Copenhagen is and how close, this is Sweden on the right. There is now a bridge between Copenhagen and Malmö, Sweden. There was not, of course, at that time, and there was not a bridge there when I went to Denmark to do the research. I'm kind of sorry there is, but you can drive across the bridge now to Sweden. I had to decide in the book where the family would be taken to get across to Sweden, and so it's not marked on this map, but up where that red dot is in the north of the coast is where I set the scene in the book. And this is one of the actual boats. Denmark, of course, has a large fishing population and many, many fishing boats. And it was the fishermen of Denmark who hid the Jews and took them across to Sweden, hid them under fish, dead fish, nets, down in the bottoms of boats. And it was a very scary journey for all of them. And this is one of the actual fishermen who did that. This picture was taken in 1992. I suppose he's no longer alive. You'll see him again in a minute. And this, as it says, a rowboat used to take Jews from the beach out to the fishing boats. There is, incidentally, one of the boats that was actually used is in the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And I just saw one in Naples, Florida, in the Holocaust Museum there. It's a very small museum, but there is a fishing boat there as well. A few of the Jews were captured. This rabbi was one, and now he's returned to Copenhagen at the end of the war. So after the book was published, I began to get reaction from readers, and I continue to. It's been, how many years did I say? 36 years. And still almost every day. Of course, now it's emails, not letters anymore. And many of those emails are, sorry to tell you this, please list all the similes and metaphors in this book. I need this information by Thursday. And yet, every now and then will be a letter that is so personal and so touching that I send a stock reply to, how do you get your ideas? They get reply number 4. But then there are many others that get a personal reply. And this is a long time ago. This is 2000. Little boy in Connecticut had read Number the Stars in school. I think it said 4th grade. And now he's about to be bar mitzvahed. And his parents agree to his request to go to Denmark for his bar mitzvah. And his name was Eric Carlin. He sent me this newspaper that told about his trip and his bar mitzvah there. And just this morning in my hotel room, it occurred to me to Google his name. I mean, if he was 12 in 2000 or 13, I mean, that's 24 years ago. He's all grown up, but I found him online, and he's an educator now, and he's out making speeches, talking still about his bar mitzvah in Denmark. This is one. This I got also 2000, and I don't have time to read you this, but this is from a child whose family had escaped from Vietnam. She says, I wasn't born yet, but my father told me about it. My older sister, in the book, the child's older sister is killed. And she says, this child says, my older sister passed away. She drowned. People escaped Vietnam on boats. The children had to go first. When I was 10, I heard my aunts talking about her on her birthday. I asked my father, and he told the story of how my sister died and how my family escaped Vietnam. So this child has seen her own history reflected in the history from another country. And I've had many such letters, everybody relating their own past. Of course, we all have immigrant stories from our own past. My grandparents came to this country from Norway. this young man on the left, well, both of these young men were members of the resistance in Denmark. In the book, the child's older sister has been killed, has been a member of the resistance, and her boyfriend has survived, and he's one of the characters in the book. But these pictures I found in the Holocaust Museum in Copenhagen, which incidentally later burned down, but they saved most of the contents and they've rebuilt it. And this young man on the left is quoted in the book, in the afterword. He wrote a letter, he was 21. On the night before he was executed, he wrote a letter to his mother, and that letter is in the museum there. I know that you're a courageous woman and that you will bear this. But hear me, it is not enough to bear it, you must also understand it. I am an insignificant thing, and my person will soon be forgotten. I'm going to interrupt myself to say he is not forgotten. But the thought, the life, the inspiration that filled me will live on. You'll meet them everywhere, in the trees at springtime, in people who cross your path, in a loving little smile. That is the great gift for which our country thirsts, something for which every humble peasant can yearn and which he can joyously feel himself to have a part in and to be working for. Finally, there's a girl whom I call mine. He also wrote a letter to his girlfriend. Make her realize that the stars will shine and that I have been only a milestone on her road. Help her on. She can still become happy. And then the next day he was shot, tied to a post and shot. These are the actual poles where those, and they were young, most of them, freedom fighters, where they were tied and killed. Their graves, and their bodies were not returned to their families. The graves were marked only with numbers. And these are the same poles still in place today in what has become a memorial park. And this is a mother holding the body of her son. And this is a wall lined with the names and the histories of each of those young people. And people come, and you can see they've left flowers at some of these places. They stand very solemnly and read each of these histories that are so important. After the book was published, a play was written. I'm trying to remember the name of the author of the play. I'm sorry it's not coming. And I've been to see it several times in several different places. And sometimes it's a horrible amateur production put on by sixth graders who giggle during the sad parts. And other times it's much more professional. In one place, I can't remember where it was, it begins with silence on the stage, and then from the back of the theater, Nazis in uniform march with guns, march down the aisles, and it's very, very stunning and frightening. And then a musical was done, and was performed at Lincoln Center for 2 years in a row, limited engagements. And this was one of the songs. There's that fisherman I showed you earlier. On the stage at this particular scene, the stage is dark, light shines on one corner, and there's a pile of coiled rope and a fisherman sitting on the rope, and he sings this song. The boat we sail is small and frail. There'll be no friendly starshine to guide the way to Sweden in the night. But hate is on the hunt, and darkness is safer than the light. I don't know your name. And in better times, we barely said hello, but you need my help. That's all I need to know. So when the moon is hidden from the sea, we shall go. When the moon is hidden from the sea, we shall go. In the book, the fisherman uncle goes out at dawn. His boat goes out at dawn, but in truth, most of those boats went at night, taking the Jews to Sweden. I was struck just now reading that. Another thing came to my mind, another true story that I wasn't able to include in the book. The line that I read there, I don't know your name, and in better times we barely said hello. I read about a man, a Jewish businessman, who was at his company, his office in downtown Copenhagen, when he got the phone call that told him what was about to happen and told him to go home and hide his wife and children. He took a train into work each day, a commuter train. And so he left his office, got back on the train, heading home, not knowing what he was going to do. And the conductor came by and recognized him as a regular commuter and said, "Are you all right? You look as if something's wrong." And the man told him, blurted out what he had just learned, and said, I don't know what I'm going to do." And the conductor said, "You bring them to my house." And the man said, "I don't even know you. I don't even know your name." And the conductor held out his hand and said, "My name is Henriksen. Bring them to my house." This is a woman who was married to a Chicago lawyer. And the Newbery Medal for Number the Stars was given in Chicago at the annual meeting of the American Library Association. And this couple came to the reception and introduced themselves to me. She, as you can see, this I just took off the internet. It's from the Shoah Project. She has died, but her testimony is there. And there's a video you can watch of her telling her story. But she told me this story that night in Chicago, that she had been 9 years old when this all happened, and she and her family had been taken to a boat. It was night. She said it was cold, it was dark. The man driving the boat got lost, and they were out on the sea, the North Sea, for quite a long time. And she said they were wet and seasick and scared. And they got to Sweden finally, and were taken ashore, and were taken to the home of a Swedish family. And their wet, filthy clothes, they were given clean clothes, and their clothes were taken to a laundry. And she said, when her father went the next day to get the clean clothes back, he found that all the pockets had been filled with candies. Okay, this is the same boy, the one who was killed when he was 21. And when I saw his picture there in the museum in Copenhagen, I was struck by his similarity to my own son, who was that age. And that has grown on me as time has gone by because of events in my own life. This is my son, who graduated from college back then. That's probably his college graduation picture. And he entered the Air Force, came to Del Rio, Texas for flight training. Some of you may know Del Rio, Texas. It's the end of the world. I'm sorry to tell you that. But I went there in order to pin my son's wings on his uniform. And then after a while, after more training in various places, he was stationed in Germany. This predates email, and I remember his first letter from Germany, and it included a picture of this castle. And his letter began, "Wanted to show you my new digs." And then the next paragraph began, "I met this countess." Well, I rolled my eyes. But it was true. He had met a countess who lived in this castle, which had been bombed during World War II, and it was undergoing restoration. And she was a widow, and she had had an apartment built into the castle, and she rented him the castle apartment. And so that's where he lived. And about the car. Every hotshot young fighter pilot who goes to Germany goes to a Porsche dealer and buys a Porsche, because that's what they do. And he did that. And at the Porsche dealer, he was taken for a test ride by the young woman who was the office manager, who had that job because she spoke several languages and had a degree in business. And to make a long story short, there he is, they got married. Now, by this time, my friend Annalisa had been divorced from her American husband and had returned to Denmark. And if you looked carefully at those maps that I went by too quickly, you'll see that Denmark shares a border with Germany. The Germans had simply marched across that border to take over Denmark. And Denmark is a very tiny country, and Germany is very large. But my friend Annalisa is now living in Denmark. My son is about to be married in Germany. She has known my son since he was 8 years old. Her son is my son's best friend. And so I wrote to her to invite her to the wedding. And she wrote back and said she was sorry, but she couldn't come. She said, I never want to set foot in Germany, and I hope they have a happy marriage, but I never want to meet a German person. And then there's after they'd been married 7 years, they had a baby girl. There she is, learning to walk. And a few months after this picture was taken, my son was killed in an F-15, and he is buried in a German cemetery beside his wife's grandfather, who died on the Russian front. The world is so small. Annalisa would not come to his funeral. This is my granddaughter the day after her father's funeral. Here's Annalisa again. Finally, time passed. This is Tivoli. Many of you, I'm sure, have been to Copenhagen. You know Tivoli Gardens, which is in the center of Copenhagen, this wonderful garden filled with music and flowers and everything. And I mentioned it here in the book. Anne-Marie, the child, is talking about Tivoli, and which has been partially destroyed. She loved Tivoli Gardens in the heart of Copenhagen. Her parents had taken her there often when she was a little girl. She remembered the music and the brightly colored lights, the carousel, the ice cream, especially the fireworks in the evening, the huge colored splashes and bursts of light in the evening sky. I remember the fireworks best of all, she said to her friend. Me too. This is the little sister, Kirsty. Me too, Kirsty said. I remember the fireworks. Silly, Anne-Marie scoffed. You never saw the fireworks. Tivoli Gardens was closed now. The German occupation forces had burned it, perhaps as a way of punishing the fun-loving Danes for their light-hearted pleasures. Kirsty drew herself up, her small shoulders stiff. I did too, she said. It was my birthday. I woke up in the night and I could hear the booms and there were lights in the sky, and Mama said it was fireworks for my birthday. Then Anne-Marie remembered. Kirsty's birthday was late in August, and that night, only a month before, she too had been awakened and frightened by the explosions. Kirsty was right. The sky in the southeast had been ablaze, and Mama had comforted her by calling it a birthday celebration. Imagine such fireworks for a little girl 5 years old, Mama had said, sitting on their bed. But the next evening's newspaper had told the truth. The Danes had destroyed their own naval fleet, blowing up the vessels one by one as the Germans approached to take over their ships for their own use. How sad the king must be, Anne-Marie heard Mama say to Papa when they saw the news. But Tivoli has been, long ago now, rebuilt, and it's just as wonderful as it always was. And when my little granddaughter was 6, perhaps, I took her there to Tivoli. And we stayed in a hotel, and I called my friend Annalisa and told her to meet me at Tivoli for dinner tonight. that I had my granddaughter with me. Annalisa was the one who said she was sorry, but she never wanted to meet a German. I told my granddaughter that my friend was coming for dinner, that my friend had known her papa when he was a little boy and could tell her funny stories about things her papa did when he was young. Like what, she asked. So I told her this one. It's a true story. My son, when he was probably 10, a friend of his father's was going to go fishing. We lived in Maine, and said he would pay my son a penny apiece for worms. And so my son went out with a shovel, and he brought in a bag eventually, after a long time, of 100 worms. And he called Mr. Donovan and told him he was ready, and Mr. Donovan came and paid him $1 and took away the bag of worms. And later called to say that there were only 50 worms because my son had cut each worm in half. My son, to exonerate him a bit, said he had been told that if a worm was cut in half, each half grew a new head and became a new worm. So theoretically, there really were 100 worms. At any rate, I told my little granddaughter that my friend Annalisa was coming to meet us for dinner and would tell her funny stories like that about her papa. Here she is. She, of course, when she was born, her parents decided that my son would speak English to her, her mother would speak German, so she grew up bilingual. And now at age 7, I remember I was visiting and she was learning to read, and she was learning to read German, which is completely phonetic. And she was having a lot of trouble with English, which, as you know, is a very difficult language to read when you're just learning. But she has since now mastered 5 languages, and she teaches language in a German gymnasium. And here she is at 12. But back to this. So she's 5 now, and we go at the appointed time, and we watch a puppet show, we see a band marching past, she rides on the carousel, and then it's time to meet my friend for dinner. And I see Annalisa coming down the path, and I know she's reluctant because my daughter-in-law was also there, the German woman and the German child. And my little granddaughter, when I pointed her out, I said, "That's my friend who knows you, knew your papa." She ran forward and held out her arms. And Annalisa knelt down and took the German child into her arms. The reason I've shown you pictures of my granddaughter slightly older is because I said there was one foreign language edition that I hadn't shown you yet. It's this one, because this is now taught in the German schools as well. And in high school, German high school students are all required to visit a concentration camp. The German government, which unfortunately is having its difficulties at the moment, but they require Holocaust education in that country. And I've already told you, I mentioned the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, which is a very impressive place. I think this is my last picture. No, stars. Okay, of course. People have often asked how I chose the title for this book, and there is a scene in the book. I probably won't find it quickly enough. Yes. When, I can't recapitulate the entire plot, but when the resistance fighter, Peter, in the book, opens the Bible and reads this psalm, "The Lord is rebuilding Jerusalem. He gathers in the scattered sons of Israel. It is he who heals the broken in spirit and binds up their wounds, he who numbers the stars one by one." There are many references to stars in the book, but the Danish Jews were never asked to wear a yellow star. A myth arose that had happened, and that the King of Denmark had worn a star in sympathy, but that is simply a made-up story. At any rate, because of the mention of stars in that particular song, and I'm sorry I don't have the cast of the musical here to sing the song Number the Stars, which is very moving. But there they are, the stars numbered one by one. And now I was told at 1:50 there would be time for questions. And so I've stuck to the timetable, and the clock tells me it's time now for questions. I will tell you that, oh, thank you. I don't know how we're going to orchestrate the question, but I will alert you to the fact that I am 87 years old, and I'm in good health, as you can see, but everything above my neck is going, eyes, teeth, and ears, and so if you ask a question, I need somebody to repeat it. Okay.
I have the questions
She's going
here,
to do it.
Lois. Thank you so much. Thank you for touching us all and for being here. Okay, first question. And raise your cards in the air, and we'll come around and pick them up. So let the questions keep coming. Could you tell us more about one of your most recent works, On the Horizon? What's it about, and could you tell us how it was published?
How it was published? Okay.
That's the question.
I should mention, and I will answer that in a second, but I should mention also my newest book, because it's the only other one of my books that deals with the Holocaust, and may therefore end up in your gift shop at some point, but it's brand new.
I hope so.
And I will just explain to you, it's called Tree Table Book, 3 nouns. And it's about an 11-year-old girl, New Hampshire, and her next-door neighbor, who is her best friend, and that woman is 89, I believe, and is beginning to have cognitive deficiencies. The child attempts to fix her friend by teaching her how to, maybe none of you have ever experienced this yet, but when you go to a doctor after a certain age, they tell you, we're going to tell you 3 words, and we want you to remember these words, and after a period of time, repeat them back. And so the child tries to train her elderly friend to remember 3 words. And the woman fails again and again. And then finally the child comes up with a plan and says, when I say the word, think of something in your past, think of a story around that world. And then the woman, who was an immigrant from Poland, tells 3 stories that are from her past as a child in Poland in the 1930s. Mm-hmm. But the one you asked about was On the Horizon.
On the Horizon.
Okay, and I'll try to be brief, but I was born, my father's a career Army officer, and I was born in Honolulu in 1937. And then we left there just before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. My father, though he was an oral surgeon, was also a very good photographer, and he had a movie camera back in those days when movie cameras were fairly unusual, and he was a good photographer. So we grew up with home movies in the days before television. And I remember again and again, Mother putting the curtains closed and Daddy setting up the big projector, and we would see the home movies. I'd seen them 100 times. Then years had passed, and my father was getting old, and I visited once and found that those old home movies were beginning to smell terrible. They were on reels with a celluloid film, and so I took them back with me to where I lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I took them to somebody at MIT, and they put them on videotape, also obsolete now. But at any rate, so now I have the videotape of the home movies. I'm going to send them back to my father. But before I do, one evening I do an unthinkable thing. I have company for dinner, and I make them watch some home movies of Baby Lois. And one of my guests was a lawyer in Boston who had been a graduate of Annapolis and then had a career in the Navy before becoming a lawyer. And he's watching politely. There's Baby Lois playing on the beach at Waikiki in 1939. And suddenly, the scene switches, and now my sister and I are watering Mother's garden in Honolulu. And John says, wait a minute, can you go back to the scene on the beach? And I figured out how to do that. Stop, rewind, and showed it again. And he said, look on the horizon, which is the name of the book. And on the horizon, hard to see because it's shrouded in mist, but there's the silhouette of a ship. My friend John is a naval officer, and he says that's the Arizona. So suddenly, I'm looking at a scene I've seen 100 times, me laughing, playing on the beach, and behind me now, though, are 1,100 young men who are going to die soon, and the whole scene changed for me. I didn't know what to do with that. It lay there in my consciousness for a long time, but that's the beginning of the book, On the Horizon, and it goes from there to Hiroshima.
Oh, my goodness. What advice would you give to young authors or those aspiring to enter the literary field?
The lyric field, you mean?
To become writers.
This is always the question I'm so often asked, and it's the one I dread the most because
I'm sorry.
I don't have any advice for young writers because they're already doing, if anyone young is serious about wanting to be a writer, they are already doing the same thing I was doing at their age, which is reading everything in sight and writing everything they can. My first published work was when I was 10 years old. Somebody found this in archives somewhere and sent me a copy. A letter to a children's magazine, 1947, August. Dear Jack and Jill, anybody remember Jack and Jill magazine? And in the letter it says, I am writing a book. It's called A Dog Named Lucky. I am on chapter 13. Well, I have no memory of writing that book, but I was writing a book every day.
Amazing.
And if it was chapter 13, that meant I'd filled 13 pages of my little notebook and was writing away. But at any rate, I don't have any concrete practical advice for would-be writers. I think they're already doing all that stuff.
Wonderful. All right, I have a number of questions, so let's try to do these rapid fire so we can get some of them. Based on the dog named Lucky, we have a question, do you have pets? And if so, what are their names?
Oh, Alfie died last year.
Aww.
And his ashes were brought to us from the veterinarian in a little pine box, and we had a ceremony. We went out into the garden with the pine box, and we were going to sprinkle his ashes on my flower garden. And we each said something wonderful about Alfie, and then we couldn't get the box open. It had a special kind of screws, and we finally buried the whole box.
Was Alfie a dog?
Alfie was a Tibetan Terrier.
Oh, darling. Oh. Can you tell us anything about your forthcoming books? Do you have some that are about to be published?
No, I have something I'm working on, which will probably, given my age, be my last book, because it takes, say, a year to write a book, and then it takes the publisher another couple of years to turn it into a book. So, but I never talk about a book while I'm working on it. I find if I talk about it, it goes out there, and then it disappears in here.
So this is not someone else's question. This is the joy of being able to ask the questions. But you've written 52 books. So how long have you been writing? 52 years?
I majored in writing at Brown University, but I was a class of 1958, and this was not at all unusual in 1950s. I dropped out at the end of my sophomore year because my boyfriend was 2 years older and he was graduating. And so I got married just after my 19th birthday. And then I had a baby when I was 21, and a baby when I was 22, and a baby when I was 24, and a baby when I was 25.
Oh, my goodness.
And then when my youngest child went to kindergarten, I went back to college. So it took me a long time. And my first book was published when I was 40.
Okay. Amazing, amazing. All right, what did you find, or do you find it hard to write about difficult topics? And if so, how do you overcome this?
What was the last word?
And if so, how do you overcome writing about difficult topics?
I don't find it difficult
You don't?
writing. To write about superficial topics is difficult.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's the
That makes
reverse.
sense.
My first book was about the death of my sister when I was young. And that was a story that I had been telling to myself in my head for years, trying to sort it out, why it happened, how it could have not happened, how we deal with it happening. And then I was asked by a publisher to write a book for young people, and that was the story that had been waiting. Not difficult.
So that fed right into this next question. How did you choose to write specifically for young people?
I thought of myself as a writer for adults, and I was writing for magazines and doing photographs for magazines. But then when I was asked by a publisher to write a book for young people, because they had read something I had written which was about a child, I wrote that first book. And it was very successful. It won I got a phone call from a man who said he was president of the IRA, and I thought that was the Irish Republican Army. But it wasn't. It was the International Reading Association, and they were giving an award, their annual award to this book. So at the same time, I began to hear from young people who had read the book. And I had 4 kids. I had been a kid, but I had not before really understood the impact that literature can have on young people. And that made me aware of it and how important it can be. And so that's what made me write the next one and the one after that.
What is the name of that first book about your sister?
I didn't want to say it because I hate the title.
Oh, okay.
The publisher asked me to do a book. They didn't tell me what it should be about. I wrote about 2 sisters, the death of the older sister, the effect on the whole family. I couldn't think of a title. I sent them the manuscript with no title. And they said they would publish it. And along the way, suddenly they called me and they said, we have to have a title. And I couldn't think of one. I bet I could if I were to reread it now. I'd think of a better title. But that's the title they put on it, and I've never liked it. And the title is A Summer to Die.
Oh, okay. What was your inspiration for The Giver and its sequel?
Actually, I told somebody here today who wasn't aware of it, so I should make everybody aware. The Giver is the first of 4 books, the Giver Quartet. Okay. So sequel is the wrong word,
Right.
But it's a hard question to answer because inspiration comes from so many different places. But my father and mother were both getting very old at the time that it was time to write a new book. I didn't yet have a new idea. There's always a few weeks or months when I think that's it, I'll never have another idea, my brain is dead now. But I would fly to Virginia to visit my parents every 6 weeks or so. And during one particular visit, I first visited my mother's in a nursing home on oxygen and blind, but her mind was intact. And we would sit and talk, reminisce. She talked often about my sister. And then when she was tired, I went to see my dad in the assisted living wing of the same facility. He was up shuffling around. He was still in better health, but his memory was going. And so my brother and I had prepared a book of photographs that would trigger memories, places we had lived, cars he had loved. He was a car guy. Dogs he had hated. He didn't like dogs. He was an army officer. Every time there was a war, World War II, Korean War, Dad would be gone, we'd get a dog. He'd come back, and the dog would be taken to live on a farm with children. Liars. At any rate, there was this book of photographs. Leafing through it with my dad, there's a picture of 2 little girls in their hand-smocked dresses. And he smiled. He said, there you are with your sister. And then he said, I can't remember her name. And I said, her name was Helen, Dad. She was named for her grandmother. And he said, whatever happened to her?
Oh.
And I said, she died, Dad. And I had to tell him how and why. And of course, he was very saddened by that. And I turned the pages, and there's a house we had lived in once. There's our maid in Japan. But in turning the pages, after a few minutes, there are now two teenage girls, and he smiles. Oh, there you are with Helen. And they said, I can't remember what happened to her. And I had to tell him again, she died, Dad. So when I was driving back to the airport in my rental car, I began to think, and this is a phrase that all writers of fiction think, what if? What if there were a way that we could manipulate the human memory, human brain, manipulate memory so that we wouldn't have to remember anything that was sad or scary from the past? Wouldn't that be a comfortable way to live? And that became the trigger for a book in which I created a community that had done that. And it had to be set in the future, of course. I've never been a writer of science fiction, but this was going to have to be a futuristic book. I carefully avoided any science, and I still get letters from usually boys would like to know exactly how they, and I have to confess, I haven't a clue. But that's how the idea for the Giver came about.
Amazing. All right, unfortunately, last question. What do you hope children and adults take away from your books?
You know, I sometimes point out to kids that the book they read, when they pick up a book by me, here's Number of the Stars. This happens to be a British edition, so it has a different cover. But they pick up a book and read it, and it's not the same book that I wrote, because they bring themselves to it and their imagination. And when I describe a meadow, for example, there's a meadow in this book. There was a meadow in my very first book. I see a meadow in my head, but they see a meadow they're creating from all the meadows they've ever seen. And so it's a reciprocal act. I've forgotten what do I hope they'll take away from it? Okay. So every reader takes away something that is intrinsic to them, which is not mine but theirs. It makes their lives less lonely, I think. Do I have a minute to tell you a story that just came to my mind as I was describing that?
Absolutely.
After A Summer to Die was published, and maybe two more books, I got a letter from a little girl in Denver, Colorado. I think she was 12. And she said she had just read A Summer to Die, and she referred to the scene where the girls are in a meadow. Mm-hmm. And she said, I could just see that meadow. She said, I want to be a writer. How did you make me able to see that meadow? And I wrote back and explained what I've just explained to you. I said, I couldn't describe every blade of grass, every shadow, every tree, but I picked out a few things that would make you able to create your own meadow in your own mind. And she wrote back sometime later, and she had read another book by me, and she said, I could just see how you did that because you explained. She said, I saw there was a scene of blah, 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 and you just put a few details in, but I could see it because I put in my own details too. And she said, I'm going to enter a writing contest. I didn't hear from her again for quite a while. Next time I heard from her was just a folded page out of the Denver Post, the newspaper. The top half of the page was a picture of her face, the big smile. Oh. And the caption was, Blind Child Wins Writing Award.
Oh.
I was thinking about that when I was coming down here on the plane. And I remembered her name. I mean, this is many years ago. I remembered her name because it was kind of an unusual name. And I Googled it. Yeah. And I added Colorado. And guess what? She's an appellate judge in Boulder, Colorado.
Oh.
And
wow.
She's a blind judge.
A blind judge. Wow.
And it had a picture of her. And she's now 49 years old. At any rate, I don't know if that answered your question.
Now you've made me cry 3 times, Lois. So I have to go back to work now. But This has been delightful. Please, everyone, help me thank
thank
Lois
you.
Lowry.